President Cyril Ramaphosa says there is a significant progress made by the authorities, Eskom and other government departments to address crime and corruption. He was speaking during his answering session in Parliament today. He says the deployment of South African National Defence Force will protect infrastructure at various Eskom power stations. Now, to discuss this a bit more further, we are joined by political analyst Dr. Ongama Mtimka. Ongama, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition tonight. I'm sure you have been keeping tabs on what has been taking place today in the National Assembly. If you can just, in a nutshell, just give us your take when it comes to, what transpired there with President Cyril Ramaphosa. Obviously, this discussion being centered around Eskom.
Good evening to you and your viewers, Mbali. Thank you for having me this evening. Unfortunately, the basis upon which to judge the performance of President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cabinet are no longer the extent to which they address things verbally, but how much they are succeeding in changing things on the ground, the lived experiences of South Africans. And unfortunately, whether it is looking at the outcomes of what they claim to be the processes that they are following, or in fact their responses in Parliament, they have lost all credibility, as far as I'm concerned, to convince South Africans that they are in charge and are busy working hard to change the multidimensional crisis that we face, which mainly centers around energy security.
One of the questions which was also asked to the president is indeed around government's position when it comes to the ruling from the High Court earlier on in the week, Ongama, and that pertains to government's appeal. We know that the North Gauteng High Court then said that in their ruling that government should make electricity available to schools, police stations and hospitals, but they are appealing that matter. Looking at that, was this something that maybe we could have expected from government, considering what the president says, that, there's not enough electricity and we can't even prioritize the most important institutions in this country?
So the president used an approach to answering this question, which one would say is a realistic acceptance of the status quo, in the sense that he was raising how the potential of the grid would be severely compromised if they were to do that and not have load shedding in these, areas, and started explaining, the implications of this obligation. What is a challenge to me, Mbali, is to get a sense that there's no sense of urgency and addressing the leadership issue of leading during a crisis that the president and his ministers are adopting. When people are facing a crisis of this nature, whose implications may be even greater catastrophe from a socioeconomic perspective, there should be questions that are asked as to what is the best that we can do in the short term, and what would be needed in order to provide enough electricity to be able to respond to the basic minimum in terms of what the challenges are. So, for example, there could be a way to quantify what it means to be able to provide enough energy to meet this obligation. And then, instead of trying to find every excuse in the book as to why it cannot be done, to ask themselves, what is needed? What else can be done if we pulled out all the stops to meet the basic minimum requirements, and then ensure that we at least address the crisis at a particular level, and then be able to pay the price for that? That's the call of leadership in all times of crisis. There's nothing that's demanded from leaders other than an approach that applies themselves to the issues and says, what is the price to be paid? That doesn't seem to be a discussion that is taking place, nor is there seemingly any willingness to say what is required that we can do. There seems to be this, tendency to want to find excuses. So when I backed, for example, the state of disaster, when it initially was announced, I thought that the administration had actually answered that question and arrived at a decision that unless we procured things differently in a different regime, we are not going to meet the basic minimum, only to find that it didn't appear to have been informed by any sense of what the situation requires, and therefore, having pushing for having a different procurement regime in order to address it.
And Ongama, it also brings us to the question of we now, during the State of the Nation address, we saw the announcement of that state of disaster. We also then saw the announcement of a Minister of Electricity. But with the current challenges facing the country in energy, we have not moved here.
Yeah, it's now become apparent that the Minister of Electricity was in line with vintage President Cyril Ramaphosa, who masters the art, as it seems, of creating smokescreen and creating a sense of false momentum. Because as it appears, it wasn't well thought out. However, I'm the kind of person who's a serial optimist, Mbali. So my view would be that Minister Ramaphosa has got the latitude to define his role, and there are two approaches in which he can define his role. One of them is this approach that they have tried to do and has gotten them butting heads, where he would seek to determine some, scope of work which is defined in terms of emerging powers. Another, though, is that the president, executive powers are vested in the president. And if somebody is a minister in the office of the president, it may be that all that they simply do, take the posture of being somebody who helps enforce accountability in the system, rather than wanting to carve a path by creating their own terms of reference or their own scope. So within the scope of what a president should do in providing leadership to cabinet, the Minister Ramaphosa could find space in order to actually be a person who, as we have done, people who work in executive support, that sometimes you actually don't need your own powers. You are actually assisting your political principal to fulfill their role. So if the approach to the development of the Ministry of Electricity, which is based on, determining and delineating a scope, is failing, there's another approach, which means what is the president expected to do? And can the Minister of Electricity assume the role that the president should be playing, because he is, after all, an executive, a political executive in the office of the president.
Yes, and Ongama,
just do that.
If I can just come in there as well,
Sure.
I'm so sorry to cut you, but we are running out of time. Something very important that also came out is something that Scopa has been trying to deal with pertaining to the former Eskom CEO, and the president there saying that there's currently no investigations being done, even though we have seen in that interview by Director saying that there are senior politicians and there are cabinet ministers who are involved in the alleged corruption at Eskom. And what is your take on that?
Again, the desire to cop out rather than to want to be accountable was evident. So the president is saying, well, there was no evidence brought by the former chief executive, and end of story. However, it is known that there is corruption in state-owned enterprises. And an approach that's more reassuring for me would be one that says, well, as far as the allegations of the chief executive, there was no evidence, but in terms of what's happening within Eskom, to deal with corruption that is known and doesn't need under the right director to have been right or wrong in order to address, this is what we are busy doing. And in fact, maybe partly in talking about the deployment of the army, it's partly addressing that. But the other challenge is that the kind of corruption that's happening and is crippling Eskom has been broader than issues of security. There's been, other elements which actually cripple Eskom, which may not, which an army cannot be competent in being able to address, and you need people with more capabilities to investigate.
All right, thank you very much. That is indeed political analyst Dr. Ongama Mtimka there, who is joining us via our Zoom line.